we're going to move to the paradox of ice, which is the panel for this morning, and we have distinguished panelists who I want to introduce you to. One of them is a very close colleague of mine, Ali Dhinojwala from the University of Akron. That's Ali. Ann Kietzig, did I do it wrong? I did it right. Ann Kietzig from McGill University, and Anish Tuteja from University of Michigan.
So maybe I'll start away. So you've got introduction of Peter Niewiarowski. So the good fortune that I have is to work with some of these colleagues at the University of Akron. Peter has been a great collaborator for many years now, and also Todd Blackledge, who works on spider silk. And you've also heard a melanin work yesterday, and really good fortune to also interact with Matt Shockey, who was at Akron before he moved to Gent. And so we are really surrounded by some very talented biologists who give us inspirations for ideas. But we've also got some really crazy students who are not afraid to venture out and really listen to our crazy ideas and do some crazy experiments, which I'm going to share with you today as an example. And we're really thankful also for some of the program managers, including at NSF, which I thought were a little bit more conservative, but they have been really open to listening to me and also allowing me to do some of these experiments that I'm going to share with you. Okay, so what are we doing? What are we trying to interested in? And today the story is about water and ice for me. And if you have driven a car today to attend the meeting, you understand that there are some incredible challenges in the energy sector because we use a lot of fossil fuels for transportation. And one of the challenges that they always face is how do we get from one place to the other with using less fuel, but also have that safety factor that when you brake on these slippery surfaces which have water and ice on it, that you have enough traction so you don't just go skid around the corner and crash into something. And this balance the tire industry has been facing for years now is how do we get that low efficiency in terms of losing friction, have less friction, but still get enough mileage on these things per gallon of gasoline that we use. And that's the big problem in terms of energy sector. And then we have all these biological examples like geckos, like other species, which seem to navigate on surfaces with very relative ease. And so I'm going to share with you 3 stories. And those 3 stories are inspiration to us in terms of designing new materials, thinking about new ideas that will allow us to perhaps one day implement in some of these challenging situations like tires. Okay. So the first story is all of these are relatively short, and is really inspired by geckos, which has been an ongoing collaboration with Peter's lab for many years now, is to look at what kind of structures do they have on their feet, which allows them to give traction on climbing vertical surfaces. And what that discovery has led to, and me and also a lot of other folks, including the talk that you will hear later today, in designing new materials which are inspired by these tiny features that are found on the hairs. And so these are dry adhesives, which you can apply, reapply, and use it, inspired by this technology, so that we don't have to work with all these gooey deposits that are left behind when we make these viscoelastic adhesives that we buy from our hardware stores. And so we were working on this for a while, and then, as I said, crazy stories. One of the students who graduated some years ago decided to ask this question: why are we looking at geckos in dry condition? Do they actually work underwater? And so to our surprise, what she did was she measured these gecko adhesion in water, not in just wet sprayed surfaces, but actually submerged in water. And she discovered that when she measures these forces on these different surfaces, she finds that the dry and the wet adhesion, the force that they can actually sustain, were equal in some of these surfaces. And that was a surprise to us. We thought that all of the time that this was a dry model, and now we have an example of a gecko working in wet condition, which was an example that we were looking for. How do they get actual good traction in wet condition? And so that led us to studying this thing in a little bit more detail. And we started noticing is that when you go to hydrophobic surfaces, which repel water, that these things hold on, where the dry and the wet is actually similar. But when you start going to hydrophilic surfaces, it's that when it switches over, and the dry is actually better than the wet adhesion. So that led us to focus on, can we actually use this idea to design adhesives which will work underwater, inspired by this discovery. But first we had to actually do this experiment to figure out why and how does it work. And so this again led to, as an example of another inspirationally student who could actually think out of the box, and he decided that we will use spectroscopy, which is something that we do in my group, and combine it with actually studying a gecko toe in direct contact with that surface and probe whether there is water in between these two surfaces. And this would not have happened if we were not at Akron working in an interdisciplinary group where we could just walk over and actually get a gecko and put them in a spectroscopy lab in between lasers and stuff like that. And we had actually a student holding it for a while, and that was not possible to do because these geckos actually bite. And so what they had to do is sacrifice a toe to do this experiment. But if you're not familiar with spectroscopy, focus on this region, which is where the water signal would show up in the IR spectroscopy band. And what we discovered is that even though when we're bringing this toe in contact with the surfaces underwater, there is very little water in between these two surfaces, which means that they're not only doing this thing effectively in adhesion, but they're actually squeezing the water out. And so that led us to designing some new materials, which I won't get into the application side today because of the time, but perhaps we can talk about during the panel discussion. The second interesting story was inspired by spiders. And so you've noticed spider webs, they're very effective in catching prey. They have these little glue droplets that are on the string there. And what we discovered is that how clever they are in using low molecular weight molecules. And normally we focus on proteins and we focus on all these complex things, but they actually use low molecular weight hygroscopic compounds to tweak their composition so that they can make the glue very tacky, and they absorb moisture from the environment to make them tacky. So we started again with this exploration. So it's interesting. So what are these salts? They look like organic compounds. They have a lot of polar molecules. These oxygen group connected to carbon, these carbonyl groups. They have these amine groups. These are all very polar compounds which absorb moisture. But the story actually was pretty interesting is because we started looking at spiders from dry habitat and compared that with wet habitats. And now you ask the question, so if they are already in wet habitat, would they need hygroscopic salt? Or if they're in dry environment, would they need something different to attract moisture? And that led to us to explain this thing in the form of composition of the salt. So they tweak this composition in such a way that the ones which are in wet environment don't really need that kind of aggressive hygroscopic salts, but the ones which are in a dry environment, they actually need that. And so with that, we could explain how they could actually control the tackiness so that there was an optimum humidity window where they would actually have the largest tackiness. And so that would be the optimum condition that they would be able to actually attract prey and capture them. And so this is now something which not only us, but other folks around the country have been trying to manipulate polymers and glue to take away water from the surfaces, because that's what the mechanism we showed, that what they do is they take the water away from the surface, keep the surfaces dry, so they are able to stick even in wet condition to surfaces. Now the last one that I want to kind of end up with is a story that started during the COVID, and the student actually did not have much time in the lab and resources, and so his mind wandered around to polar bears as a way to look for traction on ice. Now my lab has been working on ice and ice nucleation and other studies, and there our focus was how do we prevent surfaces to form ice, and so it was low adhesion, low affinity with ice. But the student who was working on this project felt that there was an opportunity to look at polar bears to understand how we could actually do it the other way. And this is going back to the tires and other application that he was thinking about in his mind. So this is a picture that his brother took in Columbus Zoo, and that's another example that we learned yesterday. This interactions with different entities leads to some very exciting innovations. And this is an example that he got inspired when he visited the zoo, and he saw that this polar bear was actually pretty adept at doing these kind of things. So what he decided to do, he collaborated with another student who was in biology. They figured out that let's go look at all these different bears and see if there are certain features on these polar bears which would explain why they have such better traction on ice and snow. And so they collected samples. They wrote to museums around the world, wherever they could get their hands on samples. They even went to taxidermists to find any sample they could get. They collected molds of these samples with taking impression on it, and then started studying whether there is certain features on it which are kind of giving them some idea as to what that could be different in these species. And so that led them to start comparing dimensions of features that they found on the polar bears. For example, looking at pad length, looking at the paw length, and one of the things that you do start out with is that these species of bears have different paw size. And so is it something about dimension itself, or is it something beyond the size scale? And so these are the kind of plots that you would look at: pad length, paw length. You would compare the width and the paw width. And what you notice from the polar bear, that there is really very little real estate that you're working with in terms of the pad area. And we don't know yet what is the fur doing, but that's a story that perhaps needs a follow-up on it. And so what we notice is that there's not much of a variation in terms of trend line, and all of these bears seems to follow some kind of power law, which essentially follows the pad width with the paw width. What then they started doing is started looking at the SEM images, because there were some indications in the 1980s that there could be some features on these polar bears that were different. And they noticed that these papillae were present, and these papillae have very unique features. And so in that paper, they suggested that the papillae may be the reason behind they having better snow traction. And these are all just observation from SEM. We don't really have a great connection. And so what we first discovered is that these papillae are not really unique to the polar bear. They're also present in the American black bear and other species of bear that we actually looked at. So that automatically proved that it's nothing to do with just the presence of a specific feature on the polar bear. So then he started looking at the topography. He started comparing the height, the diameter of the papillae. He started looking at something which is called a power spectra, which allows you to look at what is the amplitude of that roughness as a function of dimension, like in wave vector or wavelength. And he started comparing these minute features to see what kind of differences were there between these various species. And that's where some of the thing led us to this discovery that it is not the diameter. The diameter was really very much scaling with the width. But what was different was the height of the papillae. And so now, if you look at the polar bear compared to the other species trend line, the slope of that height versus diameter was much larger for the polar bears compared to the other species. Now, we don't really have an access to taking polar bears and measuring friction and measuring all that stuff. But what we could do is we could create prototypes. And these prototypes were 3D printed. And this can be done easily in a lab. We can create a snow machine. We can test some of these prototypes, measure what is the resistance. And so what the student did was he essentially designed this experiment just using plastics and 3D printing, went to the library to print these things, and he had to decide on certain shapes. And there is some intricacies in how we came up with these things. But for today, let's just pay attention to the height and the diameter ratio that he designed. He made many features. And what he did was he measured the shear stress of that snow traction, and he plotted it as a height divided by diameter ratio, which is a scaling law that he thought would be really important. And what he discovered is that shear stress really scaled with the height to diameter ratio. There was some deviation at the lower height to the diameter ratio, but it's a little bit of more nuances that I don't want to get into. But also there are these words here written down here, which also gives you idea of how actually that surface slipped. In some cases it slipped, in some cases it was like a mixed, and in some cases you actually fractured the snow. And so the deeper the trenches are, you essentially slide by fracturing it. But if it is shallower, you can imagine that it's just slipping. And so what he did was he came up with all these drawings and images as to describe that observation. And I think you will appreciate this. It's not that hard and complicated to visualize that to slide this entrenched region that you put in the snow, what you need to do is you really need to have either a very large area, which is offered by the roughness and height and diameter. And the other is if you're really fracturing things, that means you're really plowing these features into the snow to have to slide across. And so this height by diameter ratio is really key factor. And so if you think about practically, you can't make really tall stuff also, because if you're going to do it, they're going to just rip off. They won't have the physical strength. So it's a kind of a balance between height and diameter, which gets some practical solution to get a little bit of more traction on snow and ice. But even though they didn't have enough pad area, so for them it was very essential to optimize this feature to have that traction. Okay, so I see a red light here from a minute or so on, and so I'm going to end here. I did not show the application side, but hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss this during the panel discussion. So thank you very much.